Hello and welcome to everyone who's joined us. I think there's probably still a few people still joining, but we need to get started because I've been told I must not go on beyond the hour. Apparently, there's plenty of people wanting Zoom sessions through Forbes, so I've got to finish on time. As I say, welcome and thanks for zooming in. This is the second of a series of three talks that we're giving on the subject of inquests. I hope many of you caught my colleague Ridwan last week, who spoke about the coronial system generally and also a little bit about how COVID-19 deaths might impact upon inquests. Next week, I hope you'll join us again for Lucy Harris, who will be speaking about evidence and also PFD Section 28 reports. Those are reports, prevention of future deaths. That comes up in one or two of my slides, but I won't be talking about those today. I also, and it's apologize because it was advertised that I'd be speaking about the recent case of Smith. I realized that time-wise I wouldn't be able to do that justice. So what I have done instead is I've done an article which you can upload from the Forbes website on the case of Tainton and Smith, and that does it far more justice than we'd be able to do right at the end of this session. Okay, I hope by the end of the session you will have a better idea of the subjects that I'm going to deal with, which are, there's two subjects today: inquest conclusions and Article 2 inquests. The Article 2 inquests are obviously is the sort of inquests that many of you will probably have already had experience of or will have experience of in local authorities or public authorities. So that should be of some relevance to you. Anyway, we need to crack on time-wise. I'm going to start with conclusions. I was going to say, how's the hair looking? I can't blame, as you can see from the slide, I can't blame my hair at the moment on lockdown because it's always like this. But anyway, let's move on. Okay, I've asked the question there, why are we calling them conclusions? I'm sure, like me, many of you are used to the phrase inquest verdicts. And indeed, up until 2009, in the Coroners and Justice Act of that year, they were called inquest verdicts. We love changing the names of things, possibly when we don't need to. I mean, there's a prime example on the slide. I couldn't believe, I looked up when they actually changed the name from Marathon to Snickers, which was a very silly thing to do as far as I'm concerned. But believe it or not, it was nearly 30 years ago. It was July 1990, although they did bring them back very briefly at Morrison's last year for 3 months, I believe, but I didn't get one. Right, there is a bit more sense to calling them conclusions rather than verdicts in this case, because we think of verdicts in the criminal sense, and I think they were keen to dissociate inquests from criminal proceedings, and that's why they went for the term conclusions. I'm going to put my mic down a little because I do need to just have a look at some notes. I hope you can still hear me and that it's loud enough. I'm sure somebody's listening in and can tell me if the sound goes down too much. Right, the coroner at the end of an inquest has to complete a record of inquest form, and it's important that a very important rule is that must not be framed in such a way as to determine either criminal liability. Certainly no one can be named as having committed a crime in an inquest, but also civil liability. I've put at the bottom of that slide, you can see I said that's the theory, and it is something that that coroners are very conscious of, but I have attended, most of my career has been on the claimant side, forgive me for that, but I've attended a number of inquests representing families And I wish, I wish I had £10 for every time I've been told off by a coroner for straying into the area of civil liability with some of my questions. They do tend to give you one or two chances, but then come down on you pretty hard. But there's no doubt that some of the evidence that will come out in an inquest will point the way to a finding of civil liability. The conclusion shouldn't, however, determine either civil or criminal liability. Right, just very briefly, there's just to give you an idea of the type of, well, that is Form 2, that's the record of an inquest that a coroner will complete, and it lists the short form. If I say verdicts, by the way, you'll have to forgive me, I'm of the old school, but I'll try and keep to conclusions. Those are the listed there, 1 to 9 are the short form conclusions. We will look at narrative conclusions as well, and when they will be utilised. And we're going to look at the short form conclusions in a moment in a little more detail. But there's the 4 questions that the coroner has to determine, and pretty easy way to remember them is by those initials, WWWH. So it's who, when, where, and how. Who the deceased is or what was, when the deceased died, the place where the deceased died, and what is really the conclusion is that how the deceased died. And really that in an ordinary inquest, the how is really by what means. You'll see there's a distinction between ordinary inquests and when we come to talk about Article 2 inquests, in how far the conclusion can go in terms of explaining the details. As I say, we'll come to that in a while. So I've asked, before we look at the short form, well, all the conclusions, I've asked the question as to who does the how matter to, and to whom might it matter? Well, it's pretty evident that in an inquest where someone has died perhaps in unusual circumstances, then it is going to be family and friends who are very interested in the outcome and want to learn more about it. That's the obvious one. But also, of course, and particularly in Article 2 inquests, local authorities may be involved. If there was an assumption of responsibility by the local authority and someone died perhaps in a local authority care home, for instance, then they are going to be certainly interested in the outcome of the inquest and the evidence that is heard. Medical professionals, that many people die in hospital, and sometimes there is an issue over whether perhaps there's been an error in the cause of that's caused the death. A medical professional will be an interested party because he or she may wish to defend their position, or they certainly will have to give evidence, and if there's any criticism of them, they will want to put their no doubt their side of the story. Others, well, clearly civil claims do arise often out of the death of someone, and there might well be an insurer who is waiting for a claim, anticipating a claim landing on the desk, who would be interested and often do attend inquests. Even I've known life insurance people come to the inquests because, particularly if there was an issue over suicide, which might have an influence on whether there's going to be a policy paid out or something like that. So quite a few people may well be interested in the evidence and the outcome. 2 types of conclusion. I've already mentioned short form and narrative. Those are the 2 types. there are 9 short form conclusions, which we'll see in a moment. And it's interesting, well, it's important to note that narrative conclusions can appear in any inquest, but they are far more likely to appear in the enhanced Article 2 inquest. We'll come to it in a moment, how they're trying to, or certainly the chief coroner is trying to crack down a little bit on the predominance of narrative conclusions, because they have become far more common in recent years. Okay, the short form conclusions, 9, as you can see. I'll just list them there because we're going to look at them in a little bit more detail. These are the ones you'll be used to hearing regularly, and they cover most elements of death, of course. So we'll look at those in a little bit more detail. I couldn't get them all on one slide to look at them in detail, but we split it between 2. Accident, misadventure. There's quite a debate. Well, I have debated with people, including coroners, what the difference between accident and misadventure is. Essentially, we all know what an accident is. Let me give you an example, and that might illustrate it best. Let's say someone is walking along the street on a very cold and frosty day. They come to a patch of ice, slip on the ice, have a bad fall, and unfortunately bang their head on the curb, and it's so bad that they actually die as a result of that. That would be a pure accident, and that would be the outcome of the inquest. Might be a civil claim, of course, because maybe they should have gritted the pavement. But anyway, that's a different matter. Misadventure. So let's take a similar situation where somebody's walking along on the icy day. They go through a park. They see that the pond in the park has frozen over, and they think, oh, I'd love to have a little slide on that pond. So off they go into the middle of the pond. The ice breaks, and they come a cropper right in the middle of the lake and die and drown. That would be, in my view anyway, misadventure. So it's where there's an element of risk, perhaps a stupid risk taken by the person. There would almost inevitably, in my view, be a verdict of misadventure. Okay, next one, alcohol, drug related. Well, that speaks for themselves. As I said on the slide there, it's a sad but all too common conclusion that a coroner has to come to. Industrial disease. I've attended a number of inquests where industrial disease has been the conclusion. In fact, probably all of those that I've attended have been mesothelioma cases arising out of asbestos exposure. A very, very sad and horrible cancer that is caused by asbestos. So there are others, and indeed there is some talk. Those of you who listened to Ridwan last week, there may be an issue over whether COVID-19 deaths, particularly amongst professionals, doctors, etc., could come into the inquest arena as industrial diseases. We'll wait and see on that. Okay, lawful killing. That's where someone has been killed, but perhaps in a situation of maybe where someone has been defending themselves, or it may be an officer of the law who, in a situation, has had to shoot someone or kill them under attack, or where there was a danger to the public. We don't see those very often, but of course, there are situations where that applies. Unlawful killing. The criminal law definition of murder and manslaughter are used, and interestingly, that can only be found by the coroner on the criminal burden of proof, which, as you're probably aware, means beyond any reasonable doubt. Now, that's interesting because when we come to look at open verdicts and suicides, well, suicide in particular, there has been quite a significant shift in the burden of proof on that. But so far as a lawful killing is concerned, it still has to be found beyond reasonable doubt. Natural causes, well, you may be wondering why natural causes would come before the coroner. There is what I've called the 28-day rule. So if someone's died and they've not been seen for that particular illness that killed them, or haven't been seen by a doctor at all within 28 days, the death is referred to the coroner. It may well be that there would be no inquest in that. The coroner would have a look at it, and if everything seems just like reasonable and natural causes, then he would not necessarily have an inquest. But if it does go before the coroner, that is a conclusion that is available to him. I've used verdict there as an open. It should be open conclusion, but I'm not going to look at that on the next slide in conjunction with suicide. The first two there again really speak for themselves. Road traffic collision is an unfortunately common matter that comes before the coroner, and stillbirth, again, a sad one that the coroners will often see. Now, suicide is perhaps the most interesting one. Up until May last year, and the case of Armorn against the senior coroner for Oxford, suicide, like a lawful killing, had to be determined beyond reasonable doubt for that conclusion to be brought. That case decided that this had been wrong. I mean, there is some logic in this, because suicide used to be, of course, a crime, but it hasn't been a crime since 1961. I think that was behind the reasoning of the Court of Appeal when it decided that the burden should shift to balance of probabilities. That's the civil burden of proof. So I've attended inquests where it has looked pretty certain, in my view, that the person has killed themselves and knew what they were doing, but yet open verdicts have been returned. Just one or two of those that I've attended. It's because of the burden of proof, and particularly in a case where no note has been left, or that the person hasn't given a clear indication of their intention to commit to take their own life. I think coroners would have preferred to go for open verdicts. Generally speaking, that suits the families, because rightly or wrongly, there is still some stigma attached to suicide, and of course, it may make a family feel better if they feel that, you know, maybe it was a call for help and not a deliberate intention. I've said it will upset some and please others, this shift in the burden of proof. Well, it's certainly going to upset some families, and it will upset some religious organizations, or religious faiths, I should say, again, because of this stigma. Who will it please? Well, actually, charitable organizations that deal with mental health have often said that the figures are skewed because that there haven't been enough verdicts of suicide to prove the problem of mental health. So they've been lobbying, I believe, for more suicide verdicts to be returned, so that hopefully that will raise the issue. All right. When's the narrative conclusion adopted? Well, this tends to be when if someone, if the coroner, decides that some further explanation over and above what is depicted in the short form conclusion is required. Even in an ordinary inquest, you can have a narrative conclusion. Far more common, as I say in the Article 2, and indeed, although they have been, there's been a growing lot of case law concerning when narrative versions of narrative conclusions have been brought in. This has not pleased the Chief Coroner, who issued his guidance number 17, basically saying that you should be sticking in the main to the short form conclusions. If you have to have a narrative, if you feel you have to have a narrative conclusion, it should be neutral and give no indication of civil liability or indeed of your opinion. There is the Chief Coroner. I've got to point out that that is not an actual picture of the Chief Coroner, but he's not very happy with his coroners using too many narrative conclusions. I'm not going to go into prevention of future death reports because that will be dealt with by Lucy next week. Right, well, just before we conclude, just to let you know how many, there were 30,700 inquest conclusions for the last year that we have the figures, which was 2018. I got that figure from Ridwan's talk last week, and the funny thing was, I looked it up, I think the day afterwards, and it was almost exactly that number of COVID deaths. Unfortunately, it's now into the 31, maybe even 32,000 number after today. Just one more slide for you. My colleagues know I love my quotes, and I don't know why, but I find this one strangely comforting. It's a quote by Thomas Carlyle. The crash of the whole solar and stellar systems could only kill you once. So you might be walking along the pavement in ice and come a cropper that way, but even if the whole heavens exploded, you'd only die just the once. And again, as a rider, I've said that photo is not a real depiction of a crash of the entire solar system. I am not a bad photographer, actually, but I'm not that good. Right, let me just draw breath and have a little drink of my Vimto. I can assure you it's in my Forbes water carrier there. It may look like red wine, but it's not. And then we'll move on to the next subject, which is Article 2 inquests. I probably forgot something that I meant to say in that, but we should be all right for time, hopefully, if I can crack on now. Right, no picture of me on that one, you'll be glad to see. Where do we start with Article 2? Well, we'd start with it's Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights, of course, and it states that everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. No one shall be deprived of his life intentionally, save in the execution of a sentence of a court, following his conviction of a crime for which this penalty is provided by law. Now, the ECHR was brought, dates from 1953, even before my time, not much before my time, but it is before. And I think I'm right in saying that the death penalty was still law even in the United Kingdom at that time. I think it was shortly around about that time, it was probably outlawed. But in any event, it seems that certainly an insertion of I think it's Article 1 of Protocol 13 has been inserted into the ECHR since then, and that says quite clearly that the death penalty shall be abolished. No one shall be condemned to such penalty or executed. So that's certainly the situation in Britain, and I don't think there's any. I might be wrong, but certainly I don't think there's any country signed up to the ECHR that has the death penalty now, although there are 3 countries, 3 members that haven't signed and ratified the treaty, and that's Armenia, Azerbaijan, and our friend Russia. So it's possible that I might be wrong, but I don't think they're actively using the death penalty now, but it hasn't actually been totally outlawed. There are a couple of exceptions, of course. Again, the situation of self-defense to protect yourself from unlawful violence, and indeed, if you're trying to make a lawful arrest, it's better to leave that to the police, in my opinion. But if you're trying to make a lawful arrest or to prevent an escape of a person lawfully detained, and you'd have to use reasonable force. Of course, you can't just get your gun out and shoot them straight away. Then you will probably not breach the Article 2. Interesting there that it also allows, it also suggests that in action lawfully taken for the purpose of quelling a riot or insurrection. You know, we haven't had many of those recently, but watch this space. I'm not sure that we won't have them in the future. I hope I'm wrong on that. Right. Why would we have an Article 2 inquest? Well, there's essentially 2 reasons. Deaths in state custody, that's either in prison or perhaps in a police station, or under the custody of the police. It doesn't have to be in the station, of course, it could be under arrest. That will be automatically an Article 2 inquest. Interestingly, that although the NHS is clearly a derivation of the state, it's not classed as a death in a hospital, would not be classed as a death in state custody. That's the case of Parkinson, which decided that. So it's really, I think, to prevent individual errors that have led to the death of someone, even if it was a clear clinical error, coming into the Article 2 arena. There'd be quite a lot more of them if it did. Now, I would suspect that if there was a much more systematic example of death in a hospital, for instance, if they had introduced a new system, let's say for monitoring premature babies, and that went wrong somehow and there was 1 or more deaths of those babies, because that's a systematic problem, I could see that coming as an Article 2 inquest. But generally speaking, the clinical negligent one-off deaths will not be in there. The second reason for an Article 2 inquest, and this brings in a lot of you who will be listening, working for the local authorities, etc., would be a possible breach of a substantive Article 2 duty. And we're going to look at what those duties are. There's a number of them. They're very much into their various duties. So there was something on that slide. Don't know where it's gone. That's a bit strange. Let me go back one and see if it comes up when I do that. No, a positive obligation anyway. It was going to state the positive obligation on that slide. I'm not sure where it's gone. We've seen the negative obligation, which is that the state isn't allowed to hire people to go around killing people willy-nilly for the sake of it. But there is a positive obligation as well, and that is to effectively take steps to have a system in place that will investigate and deal properly with deaths that come under that have something to do with the state. It's really, we're talking about having to have a regulatory framework and the means to back that up. Oh, look, it's coming up gradually. There we go. The obligation to take preventative operational measures where the authorities knew or ought to have known at the time of the existence of a real and immediate risk to the life of an identified individual. That is known as the operational duty. So we've got systematic and operational. And the Osmond case of 2000 is quite an interesting case. That was where there were British citizens living in London. Mr. Osmond Sr. was shot dead, and his son Ahmet was quite badly injured in a shooting incident. The perpetrator was a chap called Padgett Lewis, who actually had taught young Ahmet, and somehow arising out of this relationship, teacher-pupil relationship, had started to issue threats to the family. I think mainly to Ahmet, but also to the father. And these threats were not particularly taken seriously when reported to the police. Anyway, it came about that he actually carried the threat out. As I say, father was killed and son injured. When it came before an inquest, the applicants had actually provided information to the police, which made it clear that Padgett Lewis had posed a danger, but as I say, this wasn't particularly well acted upon. When it came to the inquest, it was argued that this should be an Article 2 inquest, and it was held indeed that Article 2 was engaged. There was certainly an arguable breach of a substantive duty, and it was really based upon the fact that there was this real and immediate risk to life. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. Here we go, I have to flick. Systematic duty is an effective criminal law provision to deter the commission of offences against a person, and that has to be backed up by a law enforcement machinery. Again, Osman is authority for that, and then we must take appropriate legislative and administrative steps to protect life, for example, by the provision of a police force and criminal justice system. So, in essence, you need the laws, of course, but you also need the machinery and the ability to back that up, and obviously a police force is necessary for that. Interestingly, that can include taking reasonable measures to ensure the safety of individuals in public places. So if, for instance, there was a march or an assembly taking place, clearly not at the moment, but if there was a big march to protest against something, people perhaps were killed in a crush or whatever, and the police hadn't, it was thought perhaps that the police hadn't policed it correctly, then that is something that could come up as an Article 2 inquest. The authority for that is a Polish case, but of course it applies equally because it applies across the European jurisdiction. Little operational duty in a little bit more detail. Another important case is Rabone, and that defined what a real risk is. It's a substantial or significant risk and not a remote or fanciful one. So, for instance, let's go back to the Osmond case. I mean, if the teacher had in one of his final sessions with Ahmet said something like, you know, you've been a right pain in the backside, and I'm when I get a chance, I'm gonna get my own back on you. That would clearly not have been, even if he'd come and then killed him. I don't think anyone could have held that the threat or the you know, the issuing of the threat had been led to a real risk that this was going to be carried out. It would have been, that would be a remote or fanciful one. Sadly, it wasn't the case in the Osman situation. Immediate is, well, immediate has a clear, obvious meaning, but I don't think it can have that exact meaning in this context. It's a risk which is present at the time of the alleged breach of duty, but not something that would arise at some time in the future. So if there was a long time between perhaps a threat or a risk being created and then the death, perhaps many years later, it might not be sufficient to be regarded. Well, it wouldn't be sufficient to be regarded as immediate, one would think. Rabone also confirmed, and this is very important again in the context of local authorities. We're going to look at some examples of the cases that you'll be involved with. But Rabone suggested that the duty exists where there has been an assumption of responsibility by the state for the individual's welfare and safety. Now that, as I say, is a very, very important consideration for many of you who will be listening. Case of Osman, again, is authority, also authority for that. We've dealt with that. It isn't easy, however, to get an Article 2 inquest, and it's made clear by that case of Van Colliver, the Chief Constable, where it was stated that a very high threshold of evidence was needed before it would be regarded as a breach of the operational duty in these terms. Just having a look at my alarm clock in front of me, I think we're doing all right so far, but we've still got a bit to get through. What sort of situation where a public or local authority will get involved in an Article 2 inquest? Well, we've dealt with all of these sort of situations for various local authorities. So it could be a death in a care home. Sadly, there have been a lot of those recently, and we don't know exactly how the lack of PPE, etc., is going to play out in terms of whether these will come before the coroner in inquests. It's clear that, and you may remember what Ridwan said about this last week, it's very clear that the coroner is trying to diffuse and dampen down expectations that all these COVID-19 deaths will end up with inquests, and certainly not with Article 2 inquests. I think the coronial system would probably be overwhelmed, never mind the NHS. But so care homes could come before it. I mean, if there is a death in a care home that's perhaps local authority run, and it is clear that there may have been an issue of neglect leading to that death, then that may probably would become an Article 2 inquest. Similarly, in children's homes, particularly, there's a great duty of care to look after children, of course, and sometimes, again, unfortunately, authorities might fail in that duty, so that's another situation. Schools. Some of you listening may have attended the very mock inquest that we did in February. It seems a long time ago now, pre-lockdown days. And we did the mock inquest was based upon a situation where a caretaker had fallen from a ladder at the school and died. one of my colleagues is dealing with a very, very sad case involving a school where there was a trip abroad and a young pupil was tragically drowned. So those are the sort of situations that we regularly deal with, and you may well be called upon to give evidence in relation to. I've added there that let's not forget even domestic homes. Deaths in domestic homes could be involved if it was perhaps a local authority member of staff visiting and responsible for the deceased care. This is another one where it'll come up gradually. Article 2 in practice, there is what's known as the investigative obligation, and really this is where inquests come into play. But there's the sort of theory behind it: an obligation to initiate an effective public investigation by an independent official body into any death occurring in circumstances in which it appears that one or other of the foregoing substantive obligations has been or may have been violated, and it appears that agents of the state, and remember local authorities are agents of the state, are or may be in some way implicated. Two cases there, Middleton and Humberstone. I should say that you'll hear the expression in relation to an ordinary inquest. They may often be called Jameson inquests after the case of Jameson. Article 2 inquests, certainly amongst the those who deal with them regularly, are often referred to as Middleton inquests, and that Middleton case is perhaps the most important one to look at in terms of setting out why, when an Article 2 inquest will be convened. Why have an inquest? Well, the inquest role fits effectively like a glove the investigative duty under Article 2. In England and Wales, an inquest is the means by which the state ordinarily discharges that obligation, save where a criminal prosecution intervenes or a public inquiry is ordered into a major accident. So it's if there's a major accident involving many fatalities, and again, sadly, we've seen many examples of those in recent years with the Grenfell Tower, and of course, closer to home here anyway, the Manchester bombing. There's going to be public inquiries into those major incidents rather than individual inquests. There may be individual inquests as well into some of them, but generally speaking, it's going to be dealt with in a public inquiry. I'm not going to deal with this in fact, I'm not even going to bring it up, because the main word there is accountability. This is what will determine whether or not an Article 2 inquest is brought against a local authority. It's whether or not there is that, it's got to be accountable to the person who's died. If there is that accountability, then, and you're a derivation of the state, you are almost certainly going to find yourself with an Article 2 inquest. The case of Jordan there, and we're going to look at that. The minimum requirements that Jordan sets out in this slide. It's got to be independent. You would imagine that is an absolute prerequisite. So those implicating the events can't be too involved, except as clearly as witnesses perhaps, but they certainly can't look at it from a hierarchical or institutional point of view. It's got to be effective. Again, that speaks for itself. It's got to be capable of leading to a determination of the issues. There's got to be a sufficient element of public scrutiny of the investigation, and as one again might imagine, the next of kin of the victim must be involved in the procedure to the extent necessary to safeguard his or her legitimate interests. Those are pretty self-evident. The differences between an ordinary inquest and an Article 2 inquest, well, maybe you've been picking up on one or two of those as I've been speaking, hopefully. I've asked the question, and I think it's a reasonable question to ask, as to whether there should really be any difference. Well, I say that because in an ordinary Jameson inquest, as I've referred to them, the coroner is supposed to fearlessly and thoroughly investigate what led to the death. So he's not just dealing with the WWW, the who, when and where, he's dealing with the how. And the in Middleton, as I say, that's if you look at one case on this, the Middleton case is perhaps the major one. This was a House of Lords case that held, in order for the state to comply with its obligations under Article 2, the purpose of the inquest extends to ascertaining in what circumstances the deceased came by his or her death. So it's not just by what means, it's in what circumstances. And that leads to the enhancement of the inquest in a way which we're going to look at now as to what the practical differences are. Got a bit mad with the photographs here, so you can have a look at those as you go along. So first of all, an Article 2 inquest will involve a detailed and transparent investigation with the bereaved family playing a more prominent role. They're likely to involve a jury. In fact, a jury is only required to be convened in cases where the death occurred in prison, police custody, or in circumstances which may affect public health or safety. And in fact, a coroner can choose to convene a jury in any case. So even in an ordinary inquest, the coroner, if he chooses, could have a jury. Very, very rarely would a coroner have a jury unless he or she has to. Number 3 is not entirely divorced from number 2. If you've got a jury in place, it's likely to last longer. But of course, you're probably going to have more evidence and more questioning. So there are other reasons why it would last longer as well. More likely to involve a narrative conclusion given by a jury and may involve a Regulation 28 report. Again, that's just to briefly mention the regulation. That's a prevention of future death reports, which Lucy will deal with next week. Many of you will have been faced with notice that with these Section 28 PFD reports, which generally you don't like receiving because it makes you have to do an awful lot to ensure that you satisfy the coroner's requirements. Legal aid, it says there may be available, and stresses on the may, but note the Westminster Bridge inquest. That's Westminster Bridge there, the photograph at the bottom. As many of you will remember, there was a tragic a terrorist incident there, and a police officer, PC Palmer, sadly lost his life. It came not, as you would imagine, it came for an Article 2 inquest. And although various state authorities were represented by top and very expensive legal teams, actually to the tune, to you and me, the taxpayer, of £450,000, PC Palmer's family applied for legal aid and were refused. Now, I would imagine somebody took their case on a pro bono basis. I would be amazed if they didn't. But even so, it just underlines the fact that legal aid, it's almost impossible to get it, certainly in an ordinary inquest. but even in an Article 2 inquest, it's very, very restricted. Right, nearly done, and probably just within time. I've said there's still some restrictions. It's not a complete free-for-all. And if you remember, it's always stressed that the conclusion, whether it be in an ordinary or an Article 2 inquest, should not, certainly should not point to criminal or civil liability. And that led to the Chief Coroner's Guidance, again, number 7. It's within that number 17. It's a very long guidance note. Paragraphs 52 and 53 are interesting in setting out what can and can't be included in the conclusion, in the narrative conclusion. Paragraph 52 says, permitted judgmental words include inadequate, inappropriate, insufficient, lacking, unsuitable, unsatisfactory, and failure. On the other hand, Article 53 suggests that any words which suggest civil liability, such as negligence, breach of duty, breach of Article 2, and careless, are not permitted, as they may breach Section 10.2 of the 2009 Act. That's the Coroners and Justice Act, which again states that you mustn't point to civil liability. Well, we're really in the arena of semantics, aren't we? Because failure is allowed, unsatisfactory, inappropriate, but negligence, breach of duty is not allowed. Tainton and Smith. Tainton is, I'll very briefly mention it because that was the law, certainly up to the case of Smith, which I'm not going to deal with in any detail today, as I've said, because that's dealt with in the article. I do urge you to, if you're interested at all, to download that article. I've done it much more justice than I would at the end of this fairly lengthy talk. Tainton, in the case of Tainton, which, as I say, was what we thought was the position, the court held that admitted failings in a prisoner's medical care should be recorded as part of the record of inquest, even though those failings were found not to be causative of the death. The case of Smith seems to fly in the face of that, but you'll read more about it, as I say, in the article. There is a distinction, and I try to find a distinction, and I hope I've pointed it out in the article. Okay, just before we go on to the final slide, I hope you've found some of this interesting and know a little bit more now about what you might be facing if you come into an inquest, particularly an Article 2 inquest. We, as I say, deal with all aspects of it. This is the little advert, so please don't be afraid to ask us for advice and assistance whenever you need us. I think I've just got time for it's been quite serious as we're talking about death. I'd like to tell you just a little story. You may have heard it before if you were at the Bury mock inquest, but it's a story told by an ex-partner of ours who now sits as an assistant coroner in Blackpool, Mr. Derek Baker. Apparently, the court, or one of the courts where they sit for the inquests, is quite near the front in Blackpool. And it can get very hot on a hot summer's day. So on one of these hot summer's days, while he was convening a particularly sad inquest, it was so hot that somebody asked if the windows could be open, and they opened the windows and I think the doors. And because the proximity to the front, some as you'll probably know, if you walk along the front of Blackpool, you get quite a few buskers. Anyway, there was a busker just not too far outside, and through the windows and doors of this very sad inquest came the song, "Oh bloody, oh blada, life goes on. Oh la la, how the life goes on," which I'm sure raised a smile with some people, but perhaps not with everybody. Anyway, last slide. I think I've just satisfied the time. This seems particularly apt in the present day. It's always been one of my favourites. I did John Donne for my A level. I didn't particularly like him then, but I've grown to like him since. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Thanks very much. Please tune in for Zoom in for Lucy next week. I'm sure she'll be a bit smoother than I've been on occasions, but I do thank you for listening, and keep well, everyone. All right, goodbye.